Good afternoon and welcome everyone. My name is Robert Varady and I'm a research professor at the University of Arizona's Udall Center for Studies in Public Policy, where I've worked since 1989. Today's program commemorates the centennial anniversary of Congressman Morris K. Udall's birthday. On this occasion, we're celebrating Mo Udall's legacy of public service and his contributions to national policy. This is the second iteration of this tribute. The first was in Tucson, Arizona in April of this year. Both events have been co-sponsored by the Udall Center, the Federal Udall Foundation, and the University of Arizona Library's Special Collections. Before we begin, I'd like to take a moment to respectfully acknowledge that the University of Arizona is situated on the land and territories of indigenous peoples. Arizona is home to 22 federally recognized tribes, with Tucson being home to the O'odham Nation and the Yaqui tribe. I also note that this program is partly broadcast from the university's Center for Outreach and Collaboration located in Washington, D.C., which sits on the ancestral lands of the Anacostans or Nacotchtank, as well as the neighboring Piscataway and Pamunkey peoples. The university is committed to diversity and inclusion and strives to build sustainable relationships with sovereign nations and indigenous communities through education offerings, partnerships, and community service. We'll start today's program with some remarks from the host organizations and then hear from three highly distinguished speakers, all close colleagues and friends of Mo Udall. The last segment of the agenda will be a moderated panel discussion among 5 members of Mo Udall's immediate family, followed by a short question and answer period. Our featured speakers this afternoon will be Ambassador Cindy McCain, former Senator Jon Kyl, and former Secretary of the Interior Bruce Babbitt. To begin the program, we'll have a few words of introduction from first Dr. Robert Robbins, the president of the University of Arizona, and then in order, Professor Elliot Chu, the University of Arizona's Associate Vice President for University Research Institutes, Charlie Rose, the Chair of the Board of Trustees of the Udall Foundation, Professor Andrea Gerlach, the Director of the Udall Center, and Dr. Keith Allred, the Executive Director of the University of Arizona's National Institute for Civil Discourse. At this point, it's an honor to introduce Ambassador, oh, I'm sorry. Please, Dr. Robbins.
Thank you and good afternoon, everyone. On behalf of the University of Arizona, welcome to the Centennial Commemoration honoring Morris K. Udall's legacy of national policy. Thank you all so much for being here. I'm very happy to welcome you to this celebration of Mo Udall's legacy and all that he did for our great nation. I'm proud of the expanding collaboration between the Udall Center for Studies in Public Policy here at the university and the Federal Udall Foundation. This event is an excellent example of how the center and the foundation are working together to create a bright future for all of us. Thank you again for being here. I hope you have a wonderful conversation.
At this point, Elliot.
Thank you. I appreciate the opportunity to briefly speak about research at the University of Arizona. The Office of Research, Innovation, and Impact, or RII, supports the world-class research enterprise at the University of Arizona, which produces approximately $800 million in research activity. RII also supports 14 institutes and centers at the University of Arizona, including the Udall Center for Studies in Public Policy and the National Institute for Civil Discourse, both of which you'll hear from soon. Centers such as these harness the inspirational qualities of Mo Udall, including promoting healthy civil debate that puts the country ahead of partisanship, and using scholarship and indigenous knowledge and partnership to preserve the environment and our beautiful national landscape. RII is committed to continuing to support ethical policy research by strengthening community engagement and demonstrating the societal impacts of our innovative research. Thank you for inviting us to say a few words, and we are excited to celebrate Mo Udall's centennial birthday and all of his contributions to the country.
Thank you. Charlie?
Representing the Morris K. Udall and Stuart L. Udall Foundation at today's Morris K. Udall Centennial Celebration. Since its creation by Congress over 30 years ago, the Udall Foundation has exemplified the values that Morris Udall espoused throughout his career: integrity, civility, consensus, public service, and nonpartisanship. These values are integrated across the Udall Foundation's programs, cultivating the next generation of environmental champions through our youth-oriented program, Parks in Focus, awarding undergraduate scholarships, congressional internships, and graduate fellowships to deserving recipients for work in environmental policy, native healthcare, and tribal public policy, and resolving environmental conflicts and disputes involving the federal government, states, municipalities, tribes, and public and private organizations. These values are also the basis for the Udall Foundation's longstanding and congressionally authorized partnership with the University of Arizona. The Udall Foundation is proud to support the work of the Udall Center for Studies in Public Policy, its Native Nations Institute for Leadership, Management, and Policy program, and the University of Arizona Library's Special Collection. NNI serves as an important self-determination, self-governance, and development resource for Native nations. I want to thank President Robbins for his leadership and his support of the university's partnership with the Udall Foundation, which I believe is stronger today than at any time in our foundation's history. To have an independent federal agency devoted to protecting our environment and empowering our Native nations in the names of Morris Udall and Stuart Udall is a profound legacy in U.S. history. I also want to acknowledge the personal representation that the Udall family has provided on the Board of Trustees. Brad was a longtime member, and Udall was a longtime member. In fact, this was our very first meeting without Ann on the board. However, we do have Dennis Udall on the board now, who was confirmed over the summer. Dennis is Stuart Udall's son. We also have Tess Udall on the board now. Tess is Mark's daughter, as well as Mo Udall's granddaughter. And the presence of Dennis and Tess was felt strongly today. And certainly, I think they will do an incredible job of extending the legacy and the involvement of the Udall family in the foundation. Finally, I want to recognize that there's 3 members of our Board of Trustees here in person: Tad Johnson, Jim Huffman, and Eric Eberhardt, as well as our Executive Director, David Brown. So thank you for allowing us on behalf of the foundation to give some remarks, and we hope that today's program is a truly celebration of Mo Udall's legacy. Thank you.
Thank you, Charlie. And now Andrea Gerlach.
Thanks so much. Greetings from the Udall Center for Studies in Public Policy. We are an interdisciplinary research center housed at the University of Arizona. Our mission is to facilitate, analyze, and provide evidence-based solutions to policy issues. And we do this through research, education, and public service. The Udall Center specializes in issues related to environmental policy and indigenous governance and policy. The Udall Center is named for the Udall family, which is known for its commitment to public service. We're pleased to have a longtime partnership with the Udall Foundation, with the University of Arizona's Library Special Collection, and we're grateful for the support of RII at the University of Arizona. It's been an honor to play a role in organizing and facilitating today's celebration. Welcome.
Thank you, Andrea. And now Keith Allred.
It's a true privilege for the National Institute for Civil Discourse to participate in this commemoration of Mo Udall's life and legacy. I'm delighted to be here at the University of Arizona's new DC Center for Collaboration and Outreach with Charlie and the board members from the Udall Foundation. At NICD, our mission is to build the nation's capacity to engage our differences more constructively. If I were to put this a little bit more in Mo Udall style, I might say, we try to get Republicans and Democrats to work together. You see what a good job we've been doing. We established, the University of Arizona established the National Institute for Civil Discourse, NICD, in the wake of the Tucson shooting involving Representative Gabrielle Giffords and others as she held a Congress on Your Corner event in Tucson 11 years ago. She was another representative of Southern Arizona to the United States Congress, and in many ways in Mo fashion herself. Over the 10 years of our existence at NICD, we've been particularly grateful for Mo's example. And maybe a sign of just how polarized our times are, even the term civil discourse has become somewhat controversial, with some critiquing it, interpreting it as mere superficial politeness, and understandably critiquing it as an excuse for shutting down critiques of an unjust status quo. At the National Institute for Civil Discourse, we define civil discourse in a more robust and muscular way as the principles and best practices of civil discourse that open up rather than shut down conversation. So that's easy to say that sort of in the abstract, but we've been particularly grateful for Mo's kind of concrete embodiment of what we mean by civil discourse. Nobody would accuse Mo Udall of tepid or squishy views, passions, or advocacy. But he managed to advocate what he thought was genuinely good for the nation with characteristic down-home humility and humor that tended to attract other people to his cause rather than repelling them. We need more of that in the nation today. And so we have been particularly useful to have such a concrete example to point to of what we mean by engaging differences constructively. At no time in the 100 years since Mo's birth have we needed his approach to passionate advocacy more than we do now. And so it's a real honor for us at the National Institute for Civil Discourse to join this celebration of his legacy. Welcome.
Thank you very much, Keith. And now for real, it's a special honor for me to introduce Ambassador Cindy McCain, the United States Permanent Representative to the UN agencies in Rome. Ambassador Cindy McCain is the former chair of the Board of Trustees of the McCain Institute for International Leadership at Arizona State University, where she oversaw the organization's focus on advancing character-driven global leadership based on security, economic opportunity, freedom, and human dignity. At the McCain Institute, she chaired the Human Trafficking Advisory Council. In addition to her work at the Institute, she worked on the boards of several important organizations and projects, such as CARE, Project Cure, Operation Smile, the Halo Trust, Too Small to Fail, and Warriors of the Quiet Waters. Ambassador McCain is the wife of the late Senator Jon McCain. She's traveling just now and has graciously provided a short video message for today's event.
I apologize.
It's my great pleasure to introduce you to our next speaker, former Arizona Senator Jon Kyl. Senator Kyl currently serves as senior counsel at Covington and Burling LLP, and is a distinguished fellow in public service at Arizona State University's Watts College of Public Service and Community Solutions. And he's a distinguished scholar at the Sandra Day O'Connor College of Law. Also at Arizona State University, he is a director of the Udall Center for Water Policy, which honors his commitment to effective water governance in the Southwest. Senator Kyl, who received his bachelor's and law degrees from the University of Arizona, served 3 terms in the U.S. Senate from 1995 to 2013. Prior to that, he represented Arizona for 4 terms in the U.S. House of Representatives, overlapping with Mo Udall during his first 2 terms. In the Senate, he was chosen in 2008 to be Republican whip, the second highest position in the Senate Republican leadership. He served as whip until his retirement in 2013. Shortly after Senator John McCain's death in August 2018, Senator Kyl was appointed by Arizona Governor Doug Ducey to fill the late senator's seat until December 31st, 2018. Senator Kyl.
Thank you very much. It's a pleasure to be here as a graduate of the University of Arizona and former colleague of Morris Udall. It's a real privilege to join all of you in celebrating his 100th birthday. And I must say that it's interesting that it didn't take us too long in this program to begin to focus on an essential quality of his character, his civility. It's something that came to him naturally, I believe, but it was also very useful in his professional life and accounted, I believe, for many of his legislative achievements. And I think it does him no disservice to focus on his humor and his civility as part of his legacy, in addition to all of the achievements and accomplishments of his career. So if you'll bear with me, I'll continue that theme, because when I first think of Mo Udall, that's what I think about. I think of his personality. I think of him as a human being who really enjoyed a good story and particularly loved to tell a good story. One that I've repeated many times, and always with attribution, is his account of visiting with the publisher of the New Hampshire Manchester Union Leader newspaper, William Loeb. In 1976, when he ran for president, of course, he had to do what all presidential candidates did at the time, and that was they stopped by his office in Manchester, New Hampshire, in effect to kiss his ring and hope to get his endorsement for their campaign. He says when he went to visit with Mr. Loeb, who was, by the way, a pretty cantankerous and opinionated fellow, that he was treated for about the first 10 or 12 minutes to a diatribe against lawyers. And Mo says this went on for at least 10 minutes, railing against lawyers, when finally Loeb took a breath and said, "Well, Mr. Udall, what is it that you do?" And Mo said it just took him a second to respond, saying, "Well," he said, "I'm a lawyer, but not much of one." And I've told that story many times, as I said, because it illustrates a lot of things that are useful in a meeting or in a political context. But I think it also illustrates his self-deprecating way of using humor to make a point. But I would also say this: I don't think he just did it to make a point. I think he just enjoyed a good story. He had a great sense of humor, and I think that says something about the man. We could compare him, for example, to other political leaders who used humor. I put him in the category of Abraham Lincoln, and I can't think of very many others who really effectively used the art of storytelling. But as I said, I think more, he did it because he enjoyed it. And I refer to that first in this recollection of many recollections of Morris Udall, because it's the thing that I think made him most endearing and very human to me, and which goes back to illustrate again the concept of civility, which was a key part of his effectiveness, but also just part of his personality. It was a real honor for me to serve with Morris Udall in the House of Representatives, and then later to serve in the Senate with Mark. So it's a pleasure to be a part of this program here today. And I hope all of you who are with us enjoy it as much as I shall enjoy it myself. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Senator Kyl. I think we may try to play the Cindy McCain video. Is that right, Molly?
Yes, that is correct.
Okay.
Hello to all of the friends and relatives of Morris Udall on his 100th birthday. I'm coming to you on the banks of the Chao Phraya River in Thailand, and I'm on my way to Laos and Cambodia, working on the food security issue. I am so grateful to be included in all of this. As you know, Mo was such a great friend of John and mine as well. And Mo's the one that really taught John all about Arizona, taught him not only the love and respect that he had for the state itself, but also the people and what makes Arizona so special. So I'm just grateful that Mo was a part of my life through the years, and certainly a part of my husband's life. And more importantly, I'd like to thank all of you for sharing him through the years. I know what it means to share a public figure, and all of that means so much to those of us who get to know them and learn from them as well. So please enjoy your evening and enjoy the time and the memories that you will share tonight that were so special about Mo. And more importantly, thank you to the Udall family for all that you have given to this country. Thank you.
Very good. Now we turn to my close colleague, the Udall Center Director, Andrea Gerlach, who's a professor at the University of Arizona's School of Geography, Development, and Environment, in addition to being the director of the Udall Center. She studies water governance and policy and has published widely on how water is managed in the Western United States. Andrea will introduce our keynote speaker. Andrea?
Thanks, Bob, for the lovely introduction and for all of the work that you've done on this program and all of your years of service to the Udall Center. It's my genuine pleasure to introduce our keynote speaker today for today's program, former Arizona Governor and U.S. Secretary of the Interior, Bruce Babbitt. Secretary Babbitt shares many similarities with former Congressman Mo Udall. Mo is chair of the House Interior Committee, and then Secretary Babbitt is head of the U.S. Department of Interior. Both men focused on the beauty of our country and worked to protect scenic and historic areas of America's federal lands. Like Mo, Secretary Babbitt has been a key architect of many important environmental policies and success stories in the U.S. In Arizona, as governor, Babbitt, our most important water institutions all lead back to Governor Babbitt, most significantly the Arizona Groundwater Management Act and the creation of the Arizona Department of Water Resources and the Arizona Department of Environmental Quality. At Interior, Secretary Babbitt was instrumental in the restoration efforts of the Florida Everglades, desert protection, and habitat conservation. He helped create 22 new national monuments. Both men valued consensus and finding common ground through discourse to successfully adopt reasonable and responsible land use policies. Both men did not shy away from difficult conversations, and they carved pathways forward through diplomacy, perseverance, humility, and humor, as others have said today. Secretary Babbitt continues to inform and influence environmental policy in his post-political life. Among other things, he's the namesake of the Babbitt Center for Land and Water Policy at the Lincoln Institute of Land Policy, which promotes innovative land and water conservation practices. And he continues to inform and shape our thinking on water management in the Colorado River Basin, where we live and work. It's a real privilege for us to have Bruce Babbitt join us today as our keynote speaker. Please join me in welcoming Secretary Babbitt.
Thank you, Andrea. It's really a pleasure to be here. This event brings back a lot of wonderful memories of our time together in Arizona, and it's really a pleasure. I first met Mo clear back in 1974. as a young lawyer, I was thinking about running for public office for Attorney General, but I wasn't sure that I really had the capacity or the skills. I hadn't been active in politics at all. And one day out of the clear blue sky, I get a call from Mo, whom I really didn't. I'd met him, but I didn't really know him. And he invited me to spend a day on the campaign trail with him. So, sure. I went down to Tucson, and together we set out on a trip through his district. We started in Cochise County, and it wasn't much fun. We were met by protesters everywhere because apparently Mo had sponsored a mining reform bill that was not terribly popular in Cochise County. I'm watching this, thinking, is this really what I want to be about? Well, we eventually finished up the day in Santa Cruz County and had a bunch of meetings in Nogales where I saw a more interesting side of Arizona political life. Mo meeting with constituent groups, telling stories, listening, hearing their problems, and it went really pretty well. And then on the drive back to Tucson, Mo, in between stories and all of that, is drifting into talking about the importance of public service and why it is that young people need to get involved and with anecdotes. And I'm finally getting the idea. I think I understand. He's recruiting me, urging me to get involved, and I did. The next time that I got a call from Mo that I actually remember is during the time that I was governor. Mo called and said, Bruce, I'm planning on introducing a statewide wilderness bill. And I kind of challenged him. I said, I don't know about that. My experience is that wilderness is controversial. And the way you get at it is a small piece at a time. You pick an area where you can deal with just a few people, and then you kind of sneak it through before anybody else across the state is awakened to what's happening. And Mo said, no, that's not the right way to do it. He said, look, start with a big idea and get out there and sell and give some charisma to your proposal. And in this case, that's going to all of Arizona and saying a comprehensive approach to wilderness will really be in the best interest of the state. He then said, the next step is to listen. And I heard that pretty clearly. He set out around the entire state. He had his staff doing work everywhere, meetings with everyone, environmentalists, the business community, the mining industry, Democrats, Republicans. And then there was Senator Goldwater. And it made me think back to a really wonderful anecdote that he told often. And that was that back at the turn of the century in pioneer days, Mo's grandfather, David King Udall, had been hauled into the jail in Prescott and charged with polygamy. Mo's grandfather was a good Mormon. He had kept good care of several wives, but it was against the law. And it turned out, as the story is told, that Goldwater's uncle, who was a Democrat, who was the mayor of Prescott, bailed David King out of jail and got him safely back to St. John's. And of course, they both loved telling that story. And it was sort of an illustration of a relationship that was really solid. And the result was that in this wilderness unfolding discussion, Mo had Barry's proxy in his pocket. No question that was going to work. So, having learned from this and watched all of this, what I saw finally was a statewide wilderness bill. And it was in fact the first time that had ever been done in the United States, illustrating a way of going about this. I think subsequently there's been one other statewide wilderness thing, and that was in Alaska. And of course, it was sponsored by Mo Udall. You all know that in Arizona, water, the Central Arizona Project, is the holy grail of our existence as a state. And back then, as now, the issue which could make and break a politician was water. And it turned out at that time that the Central Arizona Project was just under construction. And inevitably, the controversy began. And in this particular case, it related to a dam called Orm Dam up north of Phoenix. And the issue was Orm Dam was going to flood more than half of the Yavapai Indian Reservation just north of Phoenix. And it had become a controversy of significant national implications. But the Arizona establishment was firm. It's Orm Dam. There is no other alternative. And the congressional delegation lined up along with the press and everyone else. And the message was Orm Dam, or you're going to take the consequences. I was ambivalent about Orm Dam, but I was in a tough position. I was a relatively new governor, and there didn't appear to be anyone else. The congressional delegation was particularly adamant. They basically said to me, well, you're a new governor. You weren't even elected to the office. We've been at this for generations. And here's a newcomer openly beginning to be skeptical. And I'm at this point thinking, I may have a short political career in this state if I continue voicing all this skepticism, and kind of at odds ends, sixes and sevens as to what I might do. I found Mo, and interestingly and predictably, he was the one member of the delegation who had not, gone off on a crusade to scorch the earth in favor of Orm Dam. So I drew him in and said, what do you think? And he said, Bruce, look, don't get out front. Don't lead with your chin. Politics is not about self-immolation. And we began a discussion in which he said, look, I'm not an expert on the rationale for this dam, but I can tell you from my own experience that nothing is the only, there may be other solutions. And what you need to do is take a step back and begin a process to draw people in. Surely in a state as big and competent as Arizona, we ought to be able to find something by way of an alternative, rather than simply running over an Indian tribe. And that advice led us to form a committee to kind of look at all the alternatives. We drew in technical people from the University of Arizona and elsewhere, the Bureau of Reclamation, and the Bureau made a big effort to help sponsor and fund the discussion. And gradually, as this played out over months and several years, public opinion began to open up, just as Mo had counseled me. And by the end of the process, we had discovered a new alternative that wouldn't simply abolish the Indian reservation, known as Plan 6, and subsequently was built out in the course of the completion of the Central Arizona project. Well, those are the kinds of lessons that I learned from Mo during all of the years that we were together. And I think that the importance of this commemoration is that in these perilous political times where we seem to be coming apart as a nation and a state, it's really important to look back and to talk about the success stories and to talk about the leaders who made it possible, and to understand that bringing out these historical events and holding up role models to the next generation that is emerging in this state and elsewhere is a really important function. We don't just commemorate Mo, we hold his life and his experience up to a new generation as a role model of, as has been stated, civility, the importance of values, of diversity, discourse, of being, as someone once said, an idealist who has the capacity to deal. So in that context, it's been an honor for me to be here, and I congratulate you for the work you're doing. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Secretary Babbitt. We're really grateful for you being here and for joining us. Well, we're moving now to the final part of this afternoon's program, and I'd like to introduce one of my longtime colleagues at the Udall Center, Professor Stephanie Carroll. Professor Carroll is Dene Atna, a citizen of the native village of Klutikan in Alaska and of Sicilian descent. This year, she is acting director of the Udall Center while I'm on sabbatical leave. Thank you, Stephanie. She's assistant professor of public health and American Indian Studies at the University of Arizona, and at the Udall Center, she serves as our associate director of the Native Nations Institute. Stephanie's interdisciplinary research group, the Collaboratory for Indigenous Data Governance, develops research policy and practice innovations for Indigenous data sovereignty. She co-founded the U.S. Indigenous Data Sovereignty Network. She chairs the Global Indigenous Data Alliance, and she co-edited the book, Indigenous Data Sovereignty and Policy. Stephanie will introduce the Udall family members who are participating in our panel today, and she'll moderate the conversation and then the Q&A. Turning it over to you, Stephanie.
Thank you, Andrea. We are honored to have the family of Morris Udall here with us today as a panel to share their experiences and memories of Mo and his lasting legacy. I'll turn it over to them to introduce themselves and share some stories, and this will be followed by a question and answer session. So please use the Zoom Q&A function to submit questions for the panelists. You can do this while they're speaking or afterwards, and we'll get to as many questions as possible as time permits as we move forward. So at this point, I'm going to hand the mic over to the family for introductions. Mark, why don't we start with you?
Hey, thanks, Stephanie. Can everybody hear me? Hey, it's wonderful to be here with everybody, and particularly for me to see Senator Kyl, with whom I served in the Senate, and Governor and Secretary Babbitt, and then it was what a treat to see Cindy. She's just beaming, and it's so wonderful to see her carrying on the McCain, but also the Hensley legacy of public service. And boy, I have so many thoughts that I could share, and I'll rein myself in. But Bruce, I thought it really resonated with me when people asked me what really motivated my dad, and this is partly what us siblings, we would like to do here, is share some stories about Dad that I think will further humanize him, also make it clear he was far from perfect. and he had many foibles, and we have fun stories as his children to share with you. But when I thought about it, for all the reasons that he was driven to be a public servant, and he thought that was the important description, and he accepted the term politician, John and Bruce, and as we all do. But he got up every day wanting to motivate young people to be involved, and I saw that over and over again. And I'd like to think his children reflect that. And in fact, there's a wonderful set of stories about a young man that lived down the street, John, from Dad, and he was an intern for Dad one summer at the age of 15 or 16. He drove in every day with my dad's Mustang, and that man went on to a public service career as a Republican, and my dad often talked about him in glowing terms and with pride. So Dad understood the need to have two strong, committed, involved political parties. But I haven't done my job here. I'm Mark Udall. I'm the eldest sibling. I live in Boulder, Colorado. I had the wonderful experience of two careers. I was an outdoor guide and headed the Outward Bound School for 10 years of the first 20 years of my adult life. And then I served in public office for 18 years, 10 years in the U.S. House, and then a 6-year Senate term until the voters fired me in 2014. I think they made a mistake, but the voters spoke, and I've been able to go on and do some wonderful things with this part of my life. But let me kick it to, and maybe we'll work through the siblings that are on in terms of age seniority. So I'll throw it to Dodie. We're all very well aware that we're missing one of the 6 of us, my brother Randy, who passed away suddenly too many years ago, but he's with us here as well in spirit. So Dodes, take it over.
Hi, my legal name is Judith, but thanks to both Mark and Randy, who weren't able to pronounce the abbreviated name of Jody, I'm now known as Dodie, and I'm very happy to be here. I've been in the field of private and public education for my adult life, and am currently working in the field of development, fundraising, and I love being outside. I also spent some time with Outward Bound in my early years, and very much miss the Sonoran Desert, Tucson. I currently live in Colorado now, and I've got to say I've been very pulled to Robert's backdrop with Finger Rock and Kimball Mountain off to his left. I believe Brad has climbed Finger Rock. I know we've all climbed Kimball Peak. And whoever, I don't know where you got that photograph, but it's lovely, Robert. So I just wanted to, it makes me miss Tucson.
That's my backyard. It really is.
It was, actually, we lived very close to Finger Rock at the end of Alvernon Avenue for a while. So very close.
That's where we live. Yeah.
All right. Well, is Ann on?
Not
Bradford,
right now.
take it away. If we don't, if she's able to join us, we'll kick it to Ann. But Brad, take it away.
So, hey, everybody, it's a delight to be here and to hear these fun stories about our father. It's a great trip down memory lane. So I'm Brad. I'm number 5 in the hierarchy. We all kind of got numbers at some point with 6 kids. Mark is 1, I'm 5. Kate is 6. I still have a professional title. I'm a senior water and climate research scientist and scholar, mind you, at Colorado State University. And my wife regularly reminds me that only 3 words in that delightful title are really true. She tells me I work on water and climate, and I'm really senior. And it's delightful to hear stories about water from Secretary Babbitt. And Jon Kyl, I want to acknowledge your efforts on behalf of Arizona in that regard. I regularly work on Colorado River issues, and in fact, the climate change aspects of the problem that we're now very deep into. Like Dodie and Mark, I live in Boulder, Colorado, moved here with our mom in the 1970s, very much miss the beauty of the Sonoran Desert and do my best to get down to Tucson at least once or twice a year, and have terrific colleagues at the University of Arizona, including Andrea and Bob and many others who professionally have been so important in mentoring me and in our interactions through the years. So let me stop there.
Molly, is Kate going to join us? Did you get her set up as a panelist, or is she gonna stand aside?
I think she's welcome to unmute herself if she'd like.
Kate, if you, okay, she says no thanks in the chat room. What we thought we might do is kick it around, maybe have a little interactive discussion, and then of course we want to leave time for Q&A, which should often be a lot of fun. And I think Senator Kyl and Governor Babbitt and others of you who are public figures always enjoyed, for the most part. Maybe if you were in Cochise County facing the small miners, you didn't, but the Q&A and the back and forth. I'm going to just, before I kick it to Dodie for a memory or two, one point when Dad ran for president, it's a heinous job. It's an important job, but all you have to do is look at the way in which presidents age in office. And I asked Dad, why would you want to be president when it looked like he had an enormous opportunity to perhaps win the nomination in 1976, which, by the way, would have really cramped my style, because if he'd been elected, I'd have had guys in suits following me around in my 20s. And I was a bit of a wild character back then. But he said to me very, very seriously, but in that way that John and Bruce and others knew him, he said, Mark, I could do more in one day for the people of this country than I can do in an entire year in the Congress. This is as important as the work is in the Congress, and as much stature as I now have. And I think that for me, that was a powerful, succinct way of outlining his ambition and his mission and what he believed in. Dodie, let me kick it to you for thoughts as a daughter, and I think in many ways, I think my dad he spent more quality time with my three sisters than he did with his three sons, or at least in a way where there was a real connection there. So take it away.
Well, I have a very strong memory of Dad, which goes back to when I think this was around 1960, so I would have been 8 years old, and we were tossing the baseball around in the backyard, and it was me and Mark and Randy. Now, if you take yourself back to 1960, it would have been, I think, easy for my father to simply say, I'm not sure you quite belong out here throwing the baseball around. And he never said that. I never felt that. It was where I belonged. And the fact that memory sticks with me so firmly tells me that there was a message there. And the message was, you do belong here, throwing the baseball with your brothers. I was an equal. And I think that speaks very strongly to who my father was and how he felt about women and the roles of women in his life. We obviously learn our values from our parents, and dads, and those values are often very subtle. Sometimes it can simply be how you walk into a room, how you speak to people, how you greet people, your body language. And so it's not always what you're actually being told. And Dad moved through the world, I think, in a very kind of soft manner, which is probably why he was so very effective as a communicator and as someone who could bring people together. And I've got some other examples, but I'll leave it at that for now.
Bradford?
Dodie, I think our father was really kind of shy, and that was never much appreciated. I think the loss of his eye as a very young man or even kid impacted him. I think his size impacted. He's 6'5", he's my height, and he really stood out. I think there was a shyness there that people didn't appreciate, maybe. My personal story about him was the opportunities that I would get to be with him in his office in the summer times. I would go back, mostly lived in Tucson, and go back and spend a couple of weeks in DC. And I was a nerd then, and I'm still a nerd. And it was a delight to spend time with him in that office and see Secretary of Interior Cecil Andrus come by one day, or to be there when Nixon resigned, to roam the halls of Congress, either with him or by myself, to wander off to the Smithsonian. It was fascinating to watch him in his own element there. At the time, one of the times he was chair of the Office of Technology Assessment, which unfortunately was abolished at one point in the 90s. Man, did he love public service. It was just so embedded in who he was. It came from his father, it came from his mother. It rubbed off on all of us in various ways. And maybe that's the story I would tell, just being able to watch him in action, and the enjoyment I got from seeing him be the real life person that he was. And hey, he inflicted, one other quick story, his stories are famous, right? I wish I had a penny for every time I heard the Goomwa joke or the Adlai Stevenson joke. He could tell stories about mules and donkeys and pigs and cactuses and caucuses. A famous story is how he returned to Alaska after the Alaska Lands Bill passed. And he would tell us that the natives at that point in time, the Alaskans, waved at him with all 5 fingers. We heard these jokes many, many times, and I think they just brought home who he was. He used that humor effectively, and as Senator Kyl said, he also enjoyed it very much. And to Senator Kyl, let me tell you, his rule was that you attributed a new joke only one time to the person that you stole it from, and then it was yours.
Hey, I think as I listened to Dodds and Brad, and then I think Bruce and John, Cindy's not directly on here, but I think of Cindy, and I know the Babbitts, the Kyls, the Udalls, the McCains all had a public service legacy, if you will, a public service commitment. I know Senator Kyl, I think if I've got it right, you have Iowa roots and came out to the U of A and became a full-fledged Arizonan, and I think that's partly what we all share, and why we have a wonderful group of people on here today. I was looking through a lot of my files the last few days, knowing this event was going to occur, and I'm also trying to, as I get into my 70s, thin down all the material I have, maybe get some of these wonderful stories I have to the U of A. But Dad battled Parkinson's disease, which is a cruel disease and hard to watch. But he had a wonderful set of stories about the challenges he faced there. But there began to be calls for him to maybe step away from office. And in 1989, I ran across this quote. He said, the only illness will force me out of office is when the voters get sick and tired of me. And that was just my dad to a T. Dose, let me kick it back to you for another story, another thought here. I think we've got 5 or 10 more minutes before we go to the Q&A. And Molly, you'll weigh in, or Stephanie will weigh in and cut us off.
Well, one of the things, Brad, when you were talking about Dad being kind of shy, I think he used his humor as a way to perhaps initially kind of interact with people and make the room feel just a little bit more comforting for him. I don't remember the joking that you saw in public in private with him. I remember him, he didn't tell those same sort of jokes. He would tell stories. But he didn't pontificate as a parent. He wasn't one who would walk into the room and, you'd sit there as the child and listen to him talk about this and that. That's not what I remember. I remember playing Scrabble with him. I remember doing puzzles with him. I remember him being kind of quiet and always very welcoming. And yet in command. I have this wonderful story of him when, I don't know, I can't remember exactly when, but Dad was a private pilot. And we were actually flying, it was back on the East Coast. We were probably flying from DC to somewhere on the East Coast there. And he was piloting. Horribly, horribly windy as we're coming into land. I mean, really, really bad winds. And it scared me. And I said, I was in the back seat. Ella, his wife at the time, was with him up front. And I said, Dad, I said, how are we going to land? And he just calmly says, as we're kind of coming in for the landing, he just says, we're just going to put her down. And that's another memory I have that's very strong. It's like he was in control. He was in charge of the airplane, and he put us down. But there was no fear or anything. It was just, we're going to land this plane and everything will be just fine.
Hey, Ann, I see our sister Ann's joined us. And it's wonderful to see Ann. And I think, I don't know if you were on earlier, sis, but you got some recognition that didn't do justice to the amazing role you've played in leadership capacity at the foundation. So we all love you and thank you. And you want to share a memory or two here, and we'll keep the conversation going.
Yeah, thanks, Marcus. Sorry, everyone. Eastern time threw me. My apologies. And thank you, Dodie, for saying more than a memory. That was very helpful in the moment. Yeah, I think there are two memories I've thought about a little bit. I think these are more sort of young adult memories. I will say that as a kid, I remember the word that I think about when I think about dad as a dad is gentle. I really felt like when I was with him and when I was with his second wife, Tiger, I always felt there was a gentleness to dad. And I do agree that he was an introvert. I don't know if that was the word that was used, but I think, and one of the things that I know, Mark, you and I have often talked about is introversion in the world of politics and how that can play out. And so I get intrigued sometimes when I think about that introversion of dad and his kind of ability to lead, even though he had that. So two memories that come to mind. One is when I came out to him as a lesbian, and my experience of his reaction to that. It was in the 70s, and even though we forget, I think, because of the change in civil rights for gay people, at least up until about a year ago, that has been really clear. But in the 70s, it was pretty scary. And I was in the process of really understanding that I was a lesbian. I think of myself more now as bisexual, but at that time, and telling Dad, and his reaction around that news was, I don't care who you love, I love you. I mean, it was that clear, it was that easy. And I felt genuine caring from Dad. And that's been a memory for me of much gratitude. I was in my 20s and just trying to figure things out. So that's one of the memories. And I think I'll leave it there.
Okay.
I've got another memory.
Go for it, Notes.
So Brad, climbing Babakivri.
Yeah, I want to hear about that.
So Babakivri Peak, which is to the southwest of Tucson, and is on the Tohono Indian Reservation, I believe. And this is a sacred spot for them. Back, I think this probably would have been 74, 73. I was probably in my early 20s. Brad may have been 16, 17. And Brad took Dad and me on a rock climbing experience to get to the top of Babakivri. And again, it speaks a lot about my father, that he trusted his son, who, Brad, you'd been rock climbing a lot and you took us up that peak. Do you have any memories of that?
I remember teaching, I think, you and him to rappel the previous day, actually. So, because you have to do a easy fifth class climb, and then you have to rappel back down it. And we didn't want the rappel back down it to be his first. And he might have actually sprained his ankle on the test rappel. But, you know, he managed to get 4,000 vertical feet and whatever, 15 miles up and down that peak the next day. It was a terrific experience. And that mountain still is important to all of us. No, that's a good story, Dodie.
He loved being outside. We did, as kids, we did some river trips with him. We also climbed, or have a memory of climbing Mount Baldy, which is closer to St. John's. Mark, that's a 11,400 foot peak. It's in the White Mountains. It's on the Apache Reservation. And so Dad, you know, we have these experiences with him where he took us outdoors, outside. I have lots of memories of doing those kinds of things with him. And not as many memories of being inside with him. You know, those kinds of experiences were often in the public, and it's when you're children and you're with your father in a public setting, it's a totally different experience, obviously. So the time that we got with him that was outside doing these outdoor activities, whether it was going camping in the backyard, you know, walking what seemed like a mile, but it was probably 100 yards from our home with sleeping bags and making a little fire in the backyard back in the day when you could do that kind of thing. Those are really special memories. And again, it speaks to Dad's ties and connection to the land.
Two other really quick thoughts I'm having too.
Go for it.
Carried into my adult life is a love of jigsaw puzzles.
Mm-hmm.
I don't know if you guys talked about this, but we would spend hours around a jigsaw puzzle, and I still carry forward. We had a whole terminology we would use. Do you all remember this? There was a breakthrough if you did a subsection and found the place for the subsection in the bigger puzzle. And I'm sure there's some other terminology, but I teach my spouse all the time. That's a breakthrough that you just did. And you can work on a subsection over here. So, I mean, the jigsaw puzzles, I still have that love of them. And Scrabble. Scrabble was just so fun. I have this memory. Dad, I could ask Dad any word that I didn't know, and he could define it. And the most obscure word, he was able to tell me a definition. So playing Scrabble with him was never a particularly, I didn't win very much, but I have a great time, and I still love that darn game. I will play Scrabble with anyone. So jigsaw puzzles and Scrabble.
Hey, I promised everybody we would share the ways in which my dad had foibles and was very human. But I never really remember seeing him angry. I do remember there's a wonderful story, though, and I think Bruce and John will really connect with this, because he was very patient. He was very kind. He'd listen. But he's on the campaign trail. And Tom Udall, our cousin, senator from New Mexico, is just retired, now ambassador to New Zealand. He was Dad's body man, as the term is today. And a man came up to Dad and said, "Hey, Mo, how you doing? You remember me?" And my dad was in that moment that we've all faced, public figures. Do you say, "No, I don't," or try and fake it? And Dad said, "I'm sorry, sir, I don't remember who you are." And this man got very mad and dressed my dad down and told him that he'd given him lots of money and how could he forget him, and on and on. And then he stomped off. And my dad turned to Tom and said, "One of these days when somebody does that to me, I'm gonna say, no, I don't know you. I don't care who the hell you are. And what have you done for me lately?" But to my dad's great credit, I don't think he ever blew up like that in public. But he wasn't a perfect man, and he could be pushed to the limit as well by people who were rude or who didn't project respect and appreciation for the work he was doing.
He got angry at me once when I left the electric typewriters on in the office you remember we used to go into the office with him, Dodie? I'm thinking and I remember we went in, and it was so much fun to go into his office in Cannon. And I remember leaving a typewriter on. He came home after the weekend. He was so angry. He was irritated with me. I never never felt scared of him, but he was mad. He thought that was like a really stupid thing I had done.
Mark, there's the famous story when he was playing basketball, either at the University of Arizona or for the Denver Nuggets, where some fan hassled him for being a liar and a terrible basketball player at the same time throughout the first half. And is told in the book, Too Funny to Be President, at some point he'd had enough and he wandered over, he took out the eye and pointed it at this guy and said, here, you try seeing with this. You could definitely push him to his limits.
Stephanie,
Yeah. So thank you for these wonderful stories. I have to tell you that you've reconfirmed my reflections when I was preparing for this on interactions that I've had with some of you and with other Mo and Stu Udall family members over the past 20-something years that I've worked at the Udall Center. Really, your openness, your authenticity, your accountability, and your humor really speak volumes about who Mo was, really. And so I'm grateful that you've been here to share these stories. So in the interest of time, I'm going to move forward to and begin with our first question from the audience, which is actually from Chris Udall, who's asking, great working with cousins on both sides of the aisle. Can you recount the story of his scheduler scheduling him more meetings in the southern and northern part of his at-large district in the same day? So he's laughing about so many great stories of public service and humor.
I don't know that story in particular, but he was a pilot, as Dodie noted, and used his small plane to get around the state early when his district was the entire state other than Phoenix. And I can remember being in that plane, going with him to Yuma to meet with irrigators, or landing at Davis-Monthan Air Force Base. And one time we returned, it was in the summer, and the Air Force folks had stuffed this huge 3-foot wide cooling tube into the cockpit of this little tiny plane. So he used that plane. He loved it. I'm sure his scheduler got excited about, him being able to get around the state quickly with Arizona's great flying weather, but I don't know this particular story.
A follow on, and hey, Chris, great to know you're on, and we forgive you for working for JD and with JD, but also for keeping alive the Northeastern Udall, Arizona stories. As some of you, maybe all of you know, every Udall is related. And so we don't ever, whenever we meet another Udall, we may never have met them or know much about them, but we're all cousins. But when Dad ran for president towards the end of that campaign, when it looked like he might really have a chance, and to use a bad pun, his campaign was taking off, they chartered I think a 737 to move him around the country. And he wandered up into the cockpit the first time that they were flying to visit with the two pilots, and began to brag about his own flying experience. And the co-pilots listened attentively and respectfully for a few minutes, but they had a lot of work to do to get ready to get this bird off the ground. And the captain turned to my dad and he said, Congressman, he said, we really appreciate hearing your stories about flying single engine airplanes. Tell you what, why don't you go back to your seat? If we get down to one engine, we'll call you up here and you can help us out. And my dad kind of stumbled back, had his little bit of a comeuppance and went back to his seat. But then he would start telling the story on himself. That was the way he worked. That was the way he rolled.
Fantastic. Thank you for sharing that. So we have another question in the Q&A. So this is just a reminder to the audience that you can submit your questions in the chat or the Q&A. Mike Crowley says, there's been a lot of forward movement recently in federal policy supporting and reaffirming tribal sovereignty, as well as the nation-to-nation relationship between tribal nations and the federal government, including the new presidential memorandum that just came out last week. So if Mo is around in the political sphere today, what priorities do you think he might have around issues for tribal sovereignty?
Who wants to grab that one? Well, I could kick it off. I think he'd be full-throated in his support. I think he'd probably say, in some respects, it's about time. And I think that travels all the way back to my grandfather, who is a justice of the Arizona Supreme Court and eventually the Chief Justice. Levi, an Old Testament name, which tended to dot the Mormon families, because the Old Testament was very important to those in the LDS world. He issued a ruling in the late 1940s that overturned the existing statutes. I may not have the sequence quite right here, but the existing statutes and the existing ways in which Arizona worked, which had deemed Native Americans as wards of the state. So they were in the same category as the mentally insane, those who had been convicted of felonies and so on. And the Native Americans didn't have the right to vote in Arizona. And Justice Udall issued a ruling that this was unconstitutional. And today we would think, well, that of course the ruling would have been issued, and of course that wrong would have been righted. But he took a lot of incoming criticism and fire and threats for issuing that ruling. That kind of mindset, if you will, and value set was woven through my dad's family, and it was woven into us around our dinner table as we became more and more exposed to public life, to public policy, to the importance that my dad and my family put on making the promises in the Declaration of Independence and the Constitution more and more real. So for my dad, just like for Indian country, it was sovereignty, sovereignty, sovereignty. And he, as Senator Kyl mentioned, and Governor Babbitt as well, the Native American communities don't always agree. They can go head to head, and Cindy McCain would talk about the challenges that Jon McCain and Jon Kyl had representing the state as a whole, and trying to bring at times Native communities together to resolve their differences. And then finally, the Udall Foundation is doing some really important work in that regard, in further enabling and empowering and welcoming and including Indian country to full participation in our politics and our policy making. Somebody else weigh in. I probably talked too much there.
Well, Mark, you might, it's also interesting thinking back on our grandmother and her experience on, writing the books and that kind of thing. Can you speak to that a little bit?
Do you want me to speak to that, or
yeah?
Anne? Louise Lee, who had a very interesting history herself, the granddaughter of John D. Lee, the infamous leader of the Mountain Meadows Massacre. But as an aside, I think one of the reasons I think Udall's really looked to the rule of law to decide conflicts and to resolve differences. And I think in our family, there's a real aversion to violence, to using physical means to carry the day. And I think some of that's tied to our grandmother, to the Lee example of zealotry in whatever form it might have appeared. But yeah, Louise Lee, our grandmother, had a very close relationship with Hopi, and in particular with a Hopi woman who was her age and raising children in the Hopi world. And they worked together to write a book entitled Me and Mine that covered a lot of what was going on in the teens, the 20s, the 30s of the last century. And again, that example, those experiences that my dad and his brothers and sisters had interacting with Indian country, I think had them understanding totally that Native Americans are humans just like the rest of us, and that the wrongs that had been perpetuated on them needed to be righted. It wouldn't happen overnight. We're still working today. We still have a long way to go. But my dad's mother and father were both deeply connected to and committed to treating the Native Americans as equals. Why would you want to? I think Dad's attitude was, why would you want to sideline some of the American population? We all have a contribution to make, but others weigh in.
I want to add sort of two thoughts. I hold this as a yes and answer. One, I think as Mark and Judith have pointed out, our family really had a social justice lens on the work they did. And I really think that carries over into all of our lives. At the same time, I think it's a really different world than the one that Dad led in. And I think it's important to acknowledge that I really think Dad would be much more, as Dad was an incredibly inclusive guy, and yet I still think he would be deeply committed to and interested to the way we're bringing more voices of Indigenous BIPOC people to the table now and looking at a much more diverse leadership world. I think he would be amazingly excited about Secretary Holland and the first Native woman to be head of the Department of Interior. And I think that Dad would put even more attention to making sure the voices of unrepresented or overlooked Indigenous people and other people were at the tables. And the other issue that I think he would be paying a lot of attention to, I don't need to tell this to anybody in the room, is the erosion of Native American rights right now is really scary. The Supreme Court, the attacks on the law that protects Native children and adoption is all of that stuff is at high risk right now. And I would hope that Dad, if he was still alive, he'd be actively in the fight on those issues.
So let me quickly hop in here. So there are 30 Native tribes in the Colorado River Basin. They're entitled to water based on a 100-plus-year-old Supreme Court doctrine known as the Winters Doctrine. 12 of those tribes don't have water rights settlements at this point. It's an enormous problem in the basin. My father's name is on a number of the earlier water rights settlements in Arizona. I think he would be all over trying to solve this right now. There's an incredible inequity in what's been done here. The tribes were not part of any of the early conversations that now make the important law of the river. And I'd like to think he'd be engaged in that to figure out how to do, how to undo the injustice here and let's get us on a firm footing.
He'd be proud of you, Brad, and all the work you're doing on that. I know that. He was very proud of his kids.
It's exciting to hear each of you talk and really see his impact on you and the way that you think through these things and your commentary on what's going on today. I'm going to shift to another question in the webinar chat. And that question comes from Dennis Udall, who asks, what was Mo's relationship to the LDS, or the Latter-day Saints?
Who wants
Well,
to grab that?
Go ahead, Mark. Go ahead.
No, you go for it.
Well, I was going to say, he left the church pretty early on, before he was old enough to go on a mission. I know his brother Stuart went on a mission. And my understanding is that the reason he left was due to the treatment that the Mormons had for women, as well as Blacks. And that would have, when you look at, he married our mom, who very strong feminist in her own right. She was also a pilot, by the way, and told stories of flying when she was pregnant with me. And I was born in 1952. So, that says a lot, a female pilot in those days. But Dad was raised very much in the Mormon church. I know our grandmother was very strong Mormon, and as young grandkids, we were exposed to some of the flannel board stories that she would tell to us about religion, but none of us ever went down that path, and that was most likely attributed to Dad.
I've got a story, but I want to make sure Brad or AJ want to weigh in on this.
It's interesting. I think that for me, there were 6 siblings. Half of them became pretty strong devout Mormons. The other half did not. And one of the things that has always intrigued me about our grandparents is how they allowed their children, I think, to figure that out. And that there wasn't a pressure at all. And I think that's carried into our generation, the generation below. I think some of our cousins are devout Mormons and some of us aren't. And when we all get together, there's this deep love and respect for the roots and the values we all share. And I think I think Dad was deeply troubled by the racism within the Mormon church pretty quickly. And that was one of the things that drove him in a different direction. But I just received a bunch of letters from Eloise, our aunt who just died, between Dad and, I need to send them to all of you, actually, between Dad and his father about his values. And it's very clear that regardless of the path that Dad was choosing, that he had a close relationship with his dad. And I think it really speaks to their values as grandparents. I regret not knowing either of them very well, actually.
Yeah, I'm getting goosebumps because when I went into public life, Dad died just a month after I was elected, and I always wished I'd had more of those conversations with him. I think the story I was going to tell quickly is on the racism front. I think around the Udall dinner table, there was a feeling of Mormons being persecuted and marginalized, and different families in the Mormon world reacted differently. But there was this value that you stand with people in communities that are treated poorly or aren't fully empowered in society. And I think we picked up on that. When Dad served in the Army, and everybody else with his one eye, how he got in by covering the same eye with different hands in the eye test. He was stationed in Louisiana, and he'd already had a connection to the law, and it was lifelong. And he already had started law school, and he ended up defending a Black soldier that had been arrested and charged with some dramatic high-level felonies for evidently throwing a bottle and assaulting some white people at a bus stop in Louisiana. And he defended that soldier successfully, in part because he pointed out to the jury that at that bus stop, a Black person wasn't allowed to go into the store, whereby he could have bought the beer or the soda that the bottle contained, that then he used to assault the white people that were there. And he was also able, a little bit like the famous movie with Jack Nicholson, where Jack Nicholson loses his cool in the witness stand. He goaded, if you will, or he gave the sheriff an opportunity to show his racist tendencies, and the jury saw that clearly. But I think being in the South and commanding as he did Black troops, he saw the injustices there, and he couldn't quite square that with the church's point of view. But he long and always gave the church a great deal of credit for his public service and community orientation. And finally, he would tell you that, and then he would get a little twinkle in his eye, and he would wink at you, and he'd say, I also learned to drink scotch in the Army. And of course, in the Mormon world, devout Mormons don't consume caffeine and alcohol. And so that was his way of saying also, hey, I've got foibles. I'm human. I like a drink at the end of the day.
Well, and he and Stuart worked together to integrate the dining hall at the University of Arizona.
Yeah.
And that would have been probably 46.
I think it was maybe a year or two later, but right in that time frame. Yeah. Yeah. And how they integrated, there's a wonderful man, Morgan Maxwell, who I just adore, and I think he's still with us. His papers need to be part of the Udall Center, but they grabbed Morgan and they just walked into the student union and sat down and they ate a meal. They didn't ask permission. They just went in, and it was the statement was really very powerful, because Stuart and Mo had some standing in that student body. Dad was student body president, and it just like, this is the moment we need to stand up for what's right here.
Yeah, it's interesting, Mark, your observation around Mormon persecution and interest. I mean, it's fascinating to me, the racist history in the Mormon church, and yet the Mormon church just came out really strongly in favor of the Defense of Marriage Act. They've been really strong about the science behind the vaccines, and there's been a lot of conversation I've had with some of our Mormon cousins that the Mormons do have a deep sense of who's been persecuted and how does that look like. And I I'm hoping they're moving on the racist part, the racism within the church as well.
What a great discussion here. I'm thankful for what you shared. So we're now at the end of our time. Thank you for being here. I'm grateful to the family members, other distinguished guests, and my co-host for creating this space to honor Mo Udall today. So this recording will be shared with all of those who registered and will be loaded onto our website next week at udallcenter.arizona.edu/Mo100. So on behalf of the Udall Center, the Udall Foundation, and the University of Arizona Library's Special Collections, as well as everybody here today, have a great afternoon and evening wherever you might be, and goodbye.